This section will be as irregular as the previous in that it provides the most basic sketch of various arguments. This is for three reasons. 1. In an article meant to criticize atheism, substantiating theism is not necessarily required. Well, actually it is, since it's the only way to argue against atheism. I mean, you can't argue against a lack of belief in X without presenting evidence that X exists. 2. Elucidating each argument and seeking to defend it against attempts to topple it would be an undertaking which, as per 1, is not necessary and would expand this article beyond its present already hefty size. But it is necessary for the reason I just explained. 3. It is important to note that these arguments function most effectively when considered together, since individually they tend to be specific to a particular point. Therefore, it seems necessary to present various specific arguments and recommend how they may work together to form a more encompassing argument. Okay, bring it. The cosmological argument. 1. The universe had a beginning. 2. Anything that had a beginning must have been caused by something else. 3. Therefore, the universe was caused by something else, a creator. 1 is questionable as it raises the question, what is the universe? If the term refers to everything that exists in all of physical reality, then this is completely unfounded. All we know at this time is that the current state of our universe, with space, time, matter, etc., began a little under 14 billion years ago. We simply don't know what was before then. In fact, the very concept of a before then may not even be coherent. The problem with all cosmological arguments is that they assume that the laws of causality as we know them apply in the absence of space, time, and anything that could serve as a material cause. It's a situation that defies our intuition, so using our intuitive understanding of cause and effect, which certainly seems to hold up within the universe, won't work. Mariano presents another version of this argument that demonstrates the problem more clearly. 1. Every part of the universe is dependent. 2. If every part is dependent, then the whole universe must also be dependent. 3. Therefore, the whole universe is dependent for existence right now on some independent being. 2 is a fallacy of composition. That something is true for the parts does not make it true for the whole. It's like saying that since every natural number except 0 can be written as a sum of 1s, and 1 is odd, every natural number is odd. Obviously, this isn't true. I also want to mention virtual particles. In quantum mechanics, things begin to exist without a cause all the time, but a common response to this objection is that they are caused to exist by the laws of physics. Fair enough, but if we're going to regard descriptive laws as agents with causal power, then why can't such laws have caused the universe itself? One answer to that is that laws can't exist in nothing, but as we established last time, something has always existed, and there's really no reason why this something can't include those natural laws. Of course, the theist won't acknowledge this, because now it's time to assert that it's not just things that begin to exist that must have a cause, only God gets a free pass, leading to my final point. The special pleading fallacy. God gets off the hook, but nothing else, because the point of the argument is to prove God. Sorry, but when you make an exception for the one thing you're trying to prove, that invalidates the argument. The teleological argument. 1. All designs imply a designer. 2. There is great design in the universe. 3. Therefore, there must be a great designer of the universe. 1 is false unless we define design as that which was made by a designer. If I grant you that definition, then 2 assumes 3, which makes it a circular argument. The universe doesn't count as having design unless there is a designer. If I don't grant that definition, then 3 does not follow from 2. In order for this to work, you have to change your definition of design as we go from 1 to 2, which is a fallacy of equivocation. But still, if we ignore all that, how does it lead to 4? Therefore God exists. Who says that the designer has to be a god, specifically your god? The ontological argument. 1. God is defined as a being than which no greater can be conceived. 2. Such a being can be conceived. 3. If there were no such being in reality, then a greater being, namely a being than which no greater can be conceived, and which exists, can be conceived. 4. Yet nothing can be greater than a being than which no greater can be conceived. 5. Therefore, a being than which no greater can be conceived, i.e. God, must exist. There's no reason to think a being is greater simply because it exists. Buddhists would certainly argue that it's greater not to exist. Also, what does great mean, and how is greatness measured objectively? And then there's the problem of trying to define something as existent. Existence is not a property that you can assign to a concept. A concept is said to exist in reality if and only if that which the concept represents exists in reality. This is determined by empirical observation, not by logical reasoning. 1. God is the entity of which nothing greater can be thought. 2. It is greater to be necessary than not. 3. God must therefore be necessary. 4. Hence, God exists necessarily. Why is it greater to be necessary? And again, what is greatness, and how is it measured objectively? Also, just as you can't define something as existent, you can't define something as necessary. The truth of a proposition is only necessary under certain conditions. What are those conditions, and can it be demonstrated that God actually is necessary under those conditions? Besides, if these arguments hold up, then the greatest being imaginable exists, and I guess I get to make up what great means. So, okay, the greatest being imaginable has eliminated everything that I think is bad in the entire universe because it's greater to have done so than not to. Well, bad things happen, so hypothesis falsified. The moral law argument. 1. Moral laws imply a moral lawgiver. 2. There is an objective moral law. 3. Therefore, there is a moral lawgiver. See my response to Chapter 4, I'm not going to go over this again. Other than that, 1 implies that moral laws are prescriptive and not descriptive. 2 is a big fat case of source place. 3, see 1. And how does this lead to 4, therefore God exists? You assert that your God is the only possible moral lawgiver. This would need to be demonstrated. This is the worst argument yet. Dostoevsky's argument from the consequences of positive atheism. 1. If atheism is true, then man is the chief of the earth. 2. If man is the chief of the earth, then he can abandon absolute standards, i.e. morality. 3. If man can abandon absolute standards, then everything is permissible. 4. Therefore, if atheism is true, everything is permissible. I'll be generous and grant you 1 and not nitpick about the terminology. Plus, I think bacteria would beg to differ regarding who's the chief of the earth. But anyway, 2 is false because we're still accountable to each other. 3 relies on 2, 4 relies on 3, it all falls apart. But still, let's say this argument was valid and sound. So what? Is the argument actually, I wouldn't like it if there were no God, therefore God exists? That's an appeal to consequences. Guess what? That's a fallacy. Reality doesn't care what you like. It is what it is. The argument from Joy. 1. Every natural, innate desire has a real object that can fulfill it. 2. Human beings have a natural, innate desire for immortality. 3. Therefore, there must be an immortal life after death. Okay. That's dumber than the moral law argument. Both 1 and 2 are completely unfounded. How do we determine that a desire is natural and innate? How do we know that all such desires can be fulfilled? Basically, this argument says if you want it to be true, it's true. It's just wishful thinking. Ronald Nash's argument from Numbers. This is a version of TAG, the transcendental argument for God. It's not presented as a syllogism, so let me just summarize it. 1. A concept can only exist in a mind. 2. Concepts exist. 3. Some concepts are eternal, natural numbers, logical absolutes. 4. Therefore, an eternal mind exists. When we talk about concepts, we're actually just messing with words, that's all. The problem is that while a concept indeed only exists in a mind, what it represents is external to the mind. Concepts are not things, they are descriptions, mental tools that help us understand things. Concepts can refer not only to physical objects, but also things like events, actions, properties, or observed patterns. Mathematics and logic in general are examples of such patterns. The concept is not the pattern itself. It's a reference to it. Once we understand that, this argument falls flat. It's not the concepts that are eternal, but the patterns they represent. Those patterns do not require a mind. Let us now consider these as a whole and note how they demonstrate some of God's attributes. No, let's not. All the arguments have been demonstrated to be invalid and or unsound. We're done. Besides, even if you could present a valid argument that appeared to be sound, all you'd have is a hypothesis. You'd still need to support that hypothesis with empirical evidence. An argument alone cannot prove that something exists in reality. You'll notice that in the summer of 2012, physicists didn't present an argument for the existence of the Higgs boson. That argument and the calculations that support its conclusion was presented in the 60s. The evidence that the particle exists isn't the argument, it's the particle itself. The evidence that God exists cannot be an argument. It has to be an empirical observation predicted by the hypothesis that God exists. Arguments are not evidence. What you need to do is show empirically that the conclusion of the argument is consistent not just with the premises, but with reality as well. If you can't do this, then you're just engaging in mental masturbation. But I guess that's all apologetics is anyway.